They crossed the street, walked through a grove of trees and approached the back of the jail. There was a stout wooden enclosure around the jail yard. Addison pounded on a solid wooden gate at the back of the yard. "Addison with prisoners," he shouted. After a sliding of wooden bars the gate was opened. The courtyard had an earthen floor. Close to the jail building and against the right-hand fence stood a small one-story brick building with 2 doorways facing the courtyard. At the near end of the small building was a rudely built woodshed. Its back wall formed by the courtyard fence, its far side adjoining the small building. The other 2 walls were of thin, weathered planks that bulged outward near the bottom. Besides the guard who had admitted the prisoners, there was one other man who paced off a vigil along the fence. He stared with sharp hostility as the little column passed his station. The prisoners were taken through the door at the back of the jailhouse. Tim's spirit was chilled as they passed along a dank corridor to the stair-well at the front of the building. The door to the stairs was made of heavy wood. It had a small barred window near the top. The corporal unclipped the key ring from his belt, and after some deliberation picked out a key. He inserted it in the lock, turned it and pulled the door open. The 5 prisoners waited as the corporal replaced the key ring and fumbled with his rifle, signaling them to precede him up the stairs. They waited again in the dusky hallway on the 2nd floor as the corporal lumbered up. Tim thought how easily they could overpower this lubberly man, get his keys, and let themselves out the front door to the street, but he remembered the guard who had stood under the 77 lamp. He gritted his teeth and clasped his hands behind his back. Corporal Addison pushed a heavy unlocked door on the other side of the corridor. It swung open, revealing a room about 10 feet by 12, at the far end of which was a small fireplace flanked by barred windows facing north. The floor was made up of splintering planks. The room was without furniture. The corporal pointed to a small doorway in the right-hand wall. "There are 2 pails in there, one for water, one for waste." He turned on his heel, stepped into the hall and slammed and locked the door. As the sound of the corporal's footfalls died away, Dawson moved to the window and stared through the bars. For the first time Tim looked closely at the 2 strange officers. They appeared to be members of the derelict group who had joined them at the Charleston depot. They looked half-starved. Their tattered uniforms hung loosely on their bony frames. The shorter of the 2 was already settling on the floor, but the other smiled faintly. Tim held out his hand and introduced Red, Dawson, and himself. Dawson turned briefly from the window and nodded. "I'm Lieutenant Peter Mills of the 8th Michigan," the stranger said, looking mournfully at the little man who had stretched himself out on the floor. "I was captured more than a year ago at James Island. I've been in Charleston jail all year. Treated as a common criminal." For just a moment a flame of anger lit the man's sunken eyes. "I ran out of money long ago," he said, "and I've got none from home. The rations in that jail weren't good enough to feed a pig. The place was filled with criminals and slatternly women. I saw hundreds of them come and go. Once when I was sick they put me in a hospital just 78 behind the prison yard, but as soon as I was better they put me back in jail again. Now I've lost the will to escape and almost lost the will to live." The effort of speaking had exhausted the man. He sank down beside the smaller fellow, who was already lost in sleep. "This man was taken from a Charleston hospital," Mills breathed. "He must be sick. He hasn't said a word." Tim reached into his pocket and pulled out a molasses cake and the one remaining orange that had belonged to Private Green. He handed them to Lieutenant Mills. "Thank you," Mills said with an expression of gratitude. "Do you mind if I eat the orange later?" "Eat it when you want," Tim said. "I'm sorry it couldn't be more." Dawson turned from the window and clasped his hands behind his back. He glanced at Red with mild hostility. Red scratched his beard and looked at Dawson. "We're in this together," he said. "We have to live together in this room and make whatever plans might benefit us all. I guess Bradford has told you about my fault." Tim spoke softly. "Forget about that." Dawson nodded almost gratefully. "But you can leave me out of your plans," he said. looking down at Mills, who had fallen asleep with the orange in his hand, and these poor wretches couldn't walk as far as the city limits. Dawson stared out the window again. "You'd have to have wings to get away from here," he said with a bitter laugh. Red turned away impatiently and sat down on the floor. Tim moved to the other window, and reached through the bars and raised the creaking sash, propping it up with a stick he found on the sill. Just across the way Tim saw a white building that seemed to be a school. It was closed now, but a scattering, 79, of children romped in the yard. 4 little girls were playing tag on a patch of grass, and 2 boys laughed and wrestled under a tree. Beside the school was a 1-story house, neat and clean, with a garden in front. A woman with a basket over her arm was just coming out of the house. In the vacant lot the guards were ordering the prisoners into ranks. Tim watched as they moved along the street toward the east. The river glistened like a sheet of polished steel in the citron light of the summer sun. Tim could see the shapes of islands where the Congaree joined the Saluda and the broad Columbia Canal followed the near shore of the Congaree and disappeared behind trees near the edge of town. The city was laid out in squares, their pattern broken by a handsome park just across the way. He heard a train whistle, and an engine and a line of cars, much like the ones that had brought them to Columbia, came into view. The train was heading north. Tim watched until it disappeared among the trees at the edge of the city and the last bit of smoke blew away. As he turned from the window the whistle sounded again, this time far away. He sat on the floor below the window, reached into the inside pocket of his blouse and pulled out his billfold and a couple of dog-eared pieces of paper. He fumbled in a pocket and brought out the stub of a pencil. The other men were all asleep. Red was slumped in a corner of the room, sleeping peacefully with a ghost of a smile across his face. Tim smoothed out a piece of paper against the surface of his billfold. Red must be dreaming of home, he thought. He sharpened his pencil against a brick, licked the point and began to write, 80, Richland Jail, Columbia, S.C., July 12, 1863, Dear Mother and Father, yesterday I was taken prisoner and today I find myself in jail. It seems I will be here for a spell, surely through no fault of yours. I have had no word from home since May. It might be worth a try to write me at the old address at Hilton Head, hoping that when the Colonel learns our whereabouts our mail will be forwarded here. I have heard of mail being taken to prisons by way of Port Royal Ferry. The rebels are often kind in such matters, as we have some of their boys too. My health is good and I am cheered by the presence of my friend Lieutenant Kelly. I have mentioned him in other letters. Of course I am hoping we may be exchanged, but we have no word of the chances for that. If you can send a box, I know that books will be a special want, and paper and pencils and a change of underclothes. I have some money but more would be useful. If it can be spared. I don't know if a sutler comes to this jail, but I imagine that things can be bought somehow. I long to see your faces more than ever now. Love to the twins, and when you see Kate in church ask her to send that long-awaited photograph. Your loving son, Timothy Bradford, Lieutenant, 7th Court. He folded the letter and put it, with the billfold and remaining sheet of writing paper, back into his pocket. He measured the pencil stub between his thumb and forefinger. And shook his head. He slipped it into his pocket. He got up from the floor and looked out the window again, this time with unseeing eyes. He turned from the 81 window and paced along the wall and back again. Now that the letter was finished he was tortured by a feeling of suffocation. He wanted to send it on its way right now, or better still, deliver it himself. 82, Chapter 10. As Tim finished his game with Red they heard the familiar rattle of keys and the sound of the lower door. There's Bull Head, said Red, coming to take us to the yard. Tim swept the chessmen off the board and set them on the mantel. They had been in the jail for nearly 5 months now. After a week or so they had been joined by the officers captured in the second attempt to take Fort Wagner. This room where they had first been imprisoned wasn't used for sleeping now. The army prisoners had been given the run of the second floor, and this had been kept as a sort of common room. They had thought of escape almost constantly. But they hadn't found a plan that was good enough. If they worked together they might overpower the guards, but the hue and cry would come too soon. Some might escape but some would surely lose their lives. Prisoners went outside under guard every day, but they were carefully watched. An open wagon came into the yard several times a week bringing, 83, food, but it went out empty. There was no place to hide on the wagon. Shortly after the arrival of his prisoners, Captain Sen had realized that their stay was to be an extended one. And he'd had double-decker bunk beds installed in the cells along the corridor. The beds were furnished with straw mattresses and one rough woolen blanket each, supplied by some kind-hearted women of Columbia. For a time the floor above the Army officers had been occupied by Army privates, but these men had been sent to Bell Island prison to suffer through the winter in the open air. Now the second floor was occupied by Navy men captured in Admiral Dahlgren's unsuccessful attempt to land an assaulting force at Sumter. Corporal Addison appeared at the top of the stairs, his holstered pistol bumping foolishly against the curve of his stomach. Another guard stood behind Addison, his bayonet glistening in the gloom. "Fall in," Addison said. "Time to take you to the yard." He might have saved himself the trouble of giving the command. Most of the men already waited in line and now they filed along the corridor, talking to each other in quiet tones. The day was warm for late fall, but Tim shivered as he moved down the stairs and walked through the lower corridor. Buttoning his ragged uniform, there was sunlight in the yard. Tim's spirits rose a little as he and Red began their walk. Some of the prisoners took out playing cards and settled against the wall, or marked out games of tic-tac-toe on the ground, but Tim and Red had discovered they could endure prison life better if they took regular exercise. They passed the one-story brick cookshack with its 2 doors, each leading to a separate kitchen. 84, Red kicked at a little mound of dust. "You seem downhearted this afternoon." There were 6 guards in the courtyard. 2 were standing near them by the wooden gate at the end of the yard. Tim spoke softly. "It's been a week since we've talked about escape. Prospects of exchange have grown dim. There's been no mail from Kate or your folks or mine for more than a month. Our money has given out and our rations are poor." While the money had lasted, the Army prisoners had pooled their funds and paid the colored woman who brought in their rations to bring in extra food and do the cooking. But when their money was gone, Sen, in his methodical way, had taken 7 volunteers, telling each to cook 2 meals 1 day a week. The midday meal was cold. Tim cooked on Mondays. He was glad to do it, to break up the routine, but Red had said he had no love for stirring pots. The meals were served in a long room on the first floor of the jail. The Navy had a separate mess. 2 sailors had volunteered for permanent duty in the kitchen. One cooked and the other was a kind of handyman who helped the cook and did the laundry for the Navy boys. As Tim and Red swung around the yard, they saw the 2 sailors lounging by the door. One of them was large and ugly. He had a jolly nature and a great mop of black hair. The other was slight with bright blue eyes and light brown hair. Both sailors expected to be exchanged. The big man cheerfully bore the name of Devil given him by shipmates of a happier time. When he saw Tim and Red he raised his hand in greeting, and the little sailor smiled. "Hello, Devil," said Tim. "What are you serving tonight?" 85, the smaller sailor, whose name was Bell, said, "Chicken cooked in wine." "Indeed," said Red. "I'll dine with the Navy tonight." He smiled at Devil. "You boys are privileged characters. How does it happen Sen lets 2 Navy men work in the cookshack at once?" Devil screwed his face into a grin. "It's because we're such capital fellows and they trust us," he said. "Nobody can trust an Army man." Tim laughed softly. "And you cook for Sen sometimes?" Devil leaned forward and fixed Tim with a roguish stare. "I plan to poison him," he whispered. There was a pounding at the gate before their time was up, and the prisoners were ordered into the building again. Tim was on kitchen duty tonight. He stood with Devil and Bell and watched as the guards opened the gate and the wagon came through. The colored boy, Tom Jackson, whom Tim had first seen in the vacant lot months before, was holding the reins. His mother, whom the prisoners called Auntie, sat beside him. As the wagon pulled up to the cook shack the woman's thin face wrinkled into a smile. Devil said, "You're late today." The woman slapped her knee and laughed. "Sorry indeed." Tom shouted, Evening, Lieutenant. Evening, sailor men. Auntie waited while her son and the white men unloaded the wagon and stored the food on the shelves in the kitchens. When they had nearly finished, she beckoned to Tim. Under the canvas just behind the seat you'll find a barrel of salt pork. Share it all around. We have no money, Tim said. Did Captain Sen order the pork? 86, never mind. The woman cackled, but if anyone asks you, tell them you paid me fair and square. Tim kept his face as straight as he could. You didn't steal it, did you, Auntie? Auntie went into gales of laughter, and a guard who watched from a little distance looked toward her uneasily. She screeched, you shouldn't talk like that to poor old Auntie. You unload the wagon now. When they had finished unloading, Tom whipped the horse around, the guards opened the gate, and the wagon moved toward the end of the yard. Tim watched as the gate swung wide. The guards made Tom rein in when the wagon was halfway through. One of them hopped to the hub of a front wheel and stabbed the ragged canvas with the point of his bayonet. Auntie screamed, don't you poke my canvas full of holes. Addison came through the jailhouse door, and the guard who had been watching them mumbled something in the corporal's ear. Addison looked toward Tim. What were you and the old crow saying? Auntie was having one of her jokes. Tim said. Addison stuck out his lower lip and motioned with his head toward the other guard. This fellow thinks I should inspect the stores. Devil grinned. Why don't you do that, Corporal? Addison, with a sour expression on his face, waddled after Tim to the army kitchen. He poked his way through sacks of comm meal and rice and boxes of crackers as Devil and Bell looked on from the yard. He shook a keg of vinegar and kicked the barrel that held the pork. What's in this? 87, dried meat or sorghum molasses. I think, Tim said. If you want me to pry off the top we can look. Never mind, Addison said, dipping his grubby hand into a tin of salt and licking his fingers one by one. I reckon nothing was smuggled in. Devil stood in the doorway, fingering his pie-shaped navy cap. What did you expect to find? Addison frowned darkly and rocked a little from side to side. Knives or guns? Oh, said Devil, smiling wickedly. 88, Chapter 11, the following Monday Addison's shout rang down the hall and the prisoners began to stir. Tim slept in a second-tier bunk. He opened his eyes and pulled up his blanket to shield himself from the chilly air. This left his feet sticking out. He stared, as he had stared 100 times before, at the rough-hewn rafters and the boards that formed the floor above. He threw off his blanket and sat on the edge of his bunk. One of his boots was lying on the end of the mattress. He reached for it and turned it over in his hands. As he looked he began to frown. If he had some money, he could send out his boots to have the soles and heels repaired. He'd noticed they leaked the last time he walked in the jail yard after a rain. Addison finished checking the beds and poked his head through the door. Ready to go to the kitchen, Lieutenant? Tim slid to the floor, found his other boot and pulled it on, balancing himself against the bunk. Combed and manicured. Ready for another day. You seem right cheerful this morning, Lieutenant, Addison said accusingly. I like to cook. It makes me happy. 89, Red pulled his blanket away from his face and looked sleepily down from his bunk. Then he pulled the blanket up again. Dawson and Mills were dead to the world. When Tim stepped into the yard he could hear Devil singing chanties in the Navy kitchen. Devil poked his head through the kitchen door and rubbed the bristles on his chin. Good morning, Lieutenant. Tim went into the army kitchen and started a fire in the stove. He pulled his toothbrush out of his pocket and held it between his teeth while he drew a cup of water from the big tank. He moistened the toothbrush, sprinkled it lightly with salt and brushed his teeth. He drew his thumb across the bristles before putting the brush back into his pocket. He cooked up a mush with cornmeal and sorghum molasses and heated a pail of coffee. When he finished cooking he took the breakfast to the army mess with the help of a guard. They carried out pails of tin plates and cups that had been soiled the night before and set them between the kitchen doors. At 10 o'clock a couple of prisoners would go under guard to the pump at the corner of the vacant lot to rinse the dishes. While other men, also under guard, would carry the waste pails to a stream that ran to the river through a culvert under the canal. Tim ate a bowl of mush and drank his coffee. He scraped the stove and tossed a couple of wooden spoons into one of the pails outside the door. He had finished his work. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then wandered into the Navy kitchen. Belle was stirring a pot full of clothes with the broken handle of a broom. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he said. "Too busy to talk," said Devil. During warmer weather the prisoners had had a weekly swim in the river and the army men had done their laundry in wooden buckets while they were at liberty in the yard. Now it was too cold for swimming, and most of the men, finding it unpleasant to do their laundry in the open air, had given it up. Tim had been waiting for a chance to talk to Sen, to see if the army prisoners could have an extra kitchen hand, as the Navy had, to do the wash and help carry the food. If they couldn't have baths, at least they should have a way to wash their clothes. Tim passed the time of day with Devil and Belle until it was time to go back upstairs. At 10:30 the prisoners were taken out for their morning airing. Tim and Red were among the first to enter the yard. They found the Navy prisoners still there. Everyone in the yard was watching Addison and the guards who had escorted the dishwashers to the pump and the pail carriers to the stream. Members of the detail were standing by the fence, their faces white as chalk. One of the guards stood close to Addison. His body was racked by sobs. His hands hung forlornly at his sides and he drew in his breath in shuddering gasps. "God help me," he wailed, "I just meant to stop him. I never meant to kill." The stricken boy was suddenly aware that army prisoners were filing into the yard. He shrank back in fear. The guards brought up their muskets, and the army men found themselves held at the end of the yard. An uneasy silence was broken by the intermittent sobbing and wailing of the guard. Addison finally mumbled something to the sentries, and he and the boy left the yard by the wagon gate. When the Navy prisoners had been taken back into the building, a tall Confederate private sauntered toward the 91 soldiers, his gray overcoat swinging at his knees. "Take your exercise," he said gruffly. "Spread out and take your exercise." Red spoke up. "What happened outside?" "Shut your mouth and mind your own affairs." The sentries stood along the fences and by the buildings. The guard was almost double now. The early morning shift was staying on duty in the yard. The prisoners who had witnessed the shooting mingled with the others. Now one of them, a man named Fraser, began to explain. "Remember Jones? Well, he's dead. Shot by the boy who went out with Addison. We're washing the waste pails in the creek, and the guards are joking with us, and I notice that Jones is working his way downstream to a place near a thick grove of trees, making a big job of rinsing his pails." The tall rebel private shouted from his place by the gate, "Break up that group. Spread out, or I'll send you back inside." Tim pretended to drift away, but he and Red stayed close enough to Fraser so that they could hear how Jones had been killed. Fraser went on. Suddenly Jones gets up and looks around, smiling at the guard in what he means to be a casual way, and points to a place in the creek. Then he says, "There's a pretty stone." Well, the guards kind of notice, because Jones's voice shakes and his face is pale. Suddenly Jones wheels and dashes among the trees toward the bridge that crosses the canal. Two of the guards are older men, but this young one dashes after Jones, quick as a rabbit, and drops him with one shot. Then he lets his rifle fall and runs and bends over Jones, quiet, while we all stand there like mutes. Then the boy starts to shake Jones and cry and carry on. 92, Fraser kept talking, but Tim and Red had heard enough and they started their walk around the yard. "Did you know Jones?" asked Tim. "Hardly at all. He was a quiet man. I wonder what was in his mind. There would be sentries on the bridge that crosses Columbia Canal. I can only think he must have gone mad. If he went that way he wasn't heading north. He must have been thinking of Beaufort, if he was thinking at all." Captain Sen came out of the jail. A soldier was with him, carrying a pasteboard box. Sen raised his voice. "Army prisoners, come here." The men gathered around. "You have heard by now," Sen said, "that one of your number tried to escape. He was shot. He should have been shot. It will serve as a lesson to you not to be foolish when you leave the prison under guard. The soldier who shot this man said he wasn't shooting to kill. I told him it is the duty of a prison guard to shoot an escaping man. I told him I would have shot the man myself. I would not hesitate to shoot one of you. Not at all. He fingered the pistol that hung at his side and smiled his frostbitten smile. And now there are better things to talk about. In this box we have some mail. The soldier reached for the letters one at a time and called out names. There was a letter for Jones. Sen snatched the letter. Red's name was called. Red took his letter and turned away. Tim heard his own name called. He reached for the letter and saw that it was addressed in Kate's fine hand. His hands trembled as he turned it over several times, then tucked it into his inside pocket. When the mail had been distributed, Sen cleared his throat. 3 of you are lucky. Bradford, Brown and Fraser received money in the mail. We have a system now. 93, he frowned. To prevent illegal exchange. I give you printed slips. You fill them out. These authorize our quartermaster to convert your money to Confederate currency at government rates. The quartermaster keeps the money in his care. As Sen droned on, Tim lost the hope of ever seeing his cash. He heard Sen's words again, but the sutler won't come to the jail as he did before. You will give your requests for goods to Corporal Addison or me. And the wagon will deliver your things to the jail. A list of goods and prices has been posted by the door at the end of your corridor. Tim reached for his slip. His family had sent him $100. He filled out the slip and gave it back to Sen, who nodded with a show of friendliness. Your goods will be brought in on Thursday, if the quartermaster has what you want. Red's face was like a happy child's. Nancy's fine, and she says the little fellow's well. Looks just like his dad. She says. Tim grinned. I'm glad she's well and the little fellow too. I'm glad he has good health to make up for his looks. Red smiled and walked away. Tim sat on the steps of the army kitchen. He took out Kate's letter and read, Stones Brook, Connecticut, October 27, 1863, Dear Tim, your letters give great pleasure to us all. We thank God your health is fine and that you have a friend like Lieutenant Kelly to lighten your days in that dark jail. I am sure it must work the other way as well. How fondly I remember the many times when I was blue until you made me laugh. Perhaps I shouldn't say it in a letter that might be read by 94, your captors, but it seems the war has taken a turning now. The defeat of Lee at Gettysburg was a blow to the Confederacy. Now we have news that General Grant is Supreme Commander in the West. Maybe he will be paying a call on you soon. Or perhaps your next letter will come from the comparative freedom of one of our army camps. How fervently you must hope for exchange. Kate had written the letter on small, thin paper, and Tim was surprised to see that the second page was blank. But when he looked more closely he saw that it was double. It was covered with spidery lines and printed all over with the faintest legends. As he looked, Tim heard footsteps on the stony earth and was startled by a voice close by. Time to go back inside, Red said. When he saw Tim's face he laughed. Did I frighten you, lad? Red started for the jailhouse door, and Tim read on. My prayers will be with you wherever you are. God give you strength to take whatever course you may deem wise. Your folks have written and we will post our letters at the same time. We have sent a surprise in a separate packet. There's something there from me. Can you guess what? I hope it will reach you in good time. Your loving, Kate. At 4 o'clock as the prisoners moved into the yard, Captain Sen hailed Tim. Lieutenant, he said solemnly, holding out an envelope, there was a letter with the money your family sent. I'm sorry I had to open it. Thank you, Captain. Here is another, said Sen, making a ceremony of giving up the second letter. Since it came from a soldier, we opened this one too. It hadn't appeared that Kate's letter had been opened, 95, but suppose it had? Then Sen would watch him like a hawk. Tim looked sharply at Sen's face and saw nothing there but that patient, meaningless smile. When they were out of earshot, Red said, "That stuffed shirt doesn't need to apologize for opening our mail. After all, we're prisoners of war. But don't let me keep you from your mail." They stood in the middle of the yard while Tim read the letter from his family. He finished reading and said, "Things are fine at home." "What's in the letter from Hilton Head?" Tim looked at the irregular, unfamiliar writing. "Don't know," he said. He unfolded the letter and read the first line. "Here, Red, it's from Green." "Did you know Green?" "Hardly at all." "Well, read it, anyway." They read, Hilton Head. S.C., November 14, 1863, Dear Lieutenant, did you think that bayonet had done me in? Well, thanks to you it didn't. That rebel maniac took me to the hospital and the surgeon there was a fine gentleman and took care of me as a father would. The thing that frightened me was getting well. I could see into the jail yard from the hospital. I pray to God your jail is not like that. A gallows stands in the middle of the yard and there were puddles all around and people lived out there in ragged tents. Whether by choice or order I couldn't say. There were many colored soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts who were captured in the second assault on the fort where you were wounded by a private in the seat of the pants. They were brave fellows, as perhaps you have heard. 96, before they had a chance to throw me in that jail I was lucky enough to be exchanged. When will you suffer that happy fate? I hope it will be soon so I can follow you into Charleston and twist that rebel corporal's nose. I never told you how I got into the fort. When you went over the crest I paused for a moment to fuss with my rifle. Well, I owe my life to that pesky thing. If I'd gone in firing they would have shot me down. When it wouldn't work I scrambled up the parapet anyway. I stumbled on a sandbag on the top and fell into the place headfirst. They took my useless gun and sat me down by a cannon to wait the battle out. It seems too bad that you are in that jail when you are almost as brave a man as I. Your faithful servant, Thomas Green, Private. Red smiled. I wish I'd known the boy. Did he really stick you in the seat of the pants? I'd forgotten that. I guess he did. Under those conditions anyone could be brave under fire.